Part 1. The average case. In June of 1945, Admiral Chester Nimitz was sitting in his office in Guam when a document crossed his desk. He read it without expression. When he finished, he set it down. He did not speak. The document was an estimate, a projection of American casualties for the first 90 days of Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of the Japanese home island of Kyushu. The number it gave for the average case, not the worst case, the mathematical middle of what the planners expected, was 267,000 American casualties. The word casualties in that sentence does not mean deaths. It means killed, wounded, and missing combined. The dead alone, in the average case, were somewhere in the range of 40 to 50,000 for those first 3 months. This was the plan that Chester Nimitz was responsible for executing. Not because anyone wanted to execute it, because no one had found a reason not to. To understand how the United States Army, Navy, and Marine Corps arrived at a document like that in the summer of 1945, you have to understand what the Pacific War had been teaching its commanders, island by island, for 3 years. Iwo Jima, 36 days, 6,821 Americans killed. The island is roughly 8 square miles. Okinawa, 82 days, approximately 12,000 Americans killed, 110,000 Japanese military dead, and somewhere between 94,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. Depending on the source and the method of counting, dead in a campaign fought across terrain they had lived on for generations. These are the numbers that the planners in 9,945 used when they tried to calculate what was coming. Each island had produced the same lesson. Japanese forces did not surrender in any meaningful numbers. They fought until the position was physically destroyed or until everyone capable of fighting was dead. American commanders could predict with reasonable accuracy how long it would take to neutralize a given area. They could not predict with any optimisms what it was going to cost. Kyushu was not Iwo Jima. It was not even Okinawa. Kyushu is roughly the size of Switzerland. Its coastline front of multiple potential landing zones across 3 separate approaches. Its interior was mountainous and heavily forested. Its southern shore facing the approaches the invasion fleet would have to use was lined with cliffs and beaches that a defending force had been preparing for months. The plan for Kyushu was called Operation Olympic. It was to be the first phase of Operation Downfall, which was the overall name for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Olympic called for 767,000 American troops to land on Kyushu beginning November 1st, 1945, not in total over the course of the campaign. On the first day and in the days immediately following, the landing beaches had been given code names taken from American automobile brands: Austin, Buick, Cadillac, Chevrolet, Dodge, Ford. The D-Day landings at Normandy had put approximately 156,000 men ashore on June 6th, 1944. It remains one of the most studied and memorialized military operations in the history of the world. Operation Olympic was to land nearly 5 times that many men on the opening. If Olympic succeeded, it would be followed by Operation Coronet, the landing on the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. That operation called for a force of more than 1.5 million men. March 1st, 1946 was the target date. The men planning these operations were not optimists. Douglas MacArthur was 65 years old in the summer of 1945. He was the supreme commander of Allied land forces in the Pacific and the man designated to command the ground invasion if it came. He and Nimitz had been working in the same theater for 3 years with an institutional tension that was not always managed smoothly. They had different temperaments, different constituencies, different visions of how the Pacific War should be fought and who should receive the credit for fighting it. MacArthur knew about Operation Downfall. What he did not know, not fully, not until late July of 1945, was that a parallel process was underway that might make it unnecessary. He was told about the Manhattan Project approximately 1 week before the Trinity test in New Mexico. The man who was designated to command the largest amphibious operation in human history learned about the weapon that might render it obsolete only a month before the war ended. That gap in information was not an accident. The Manhattan Project operated under a level of secrecy that was, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible in scale. Billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of workers across dozens of facilities from New Mexico to Tennessee to Washington State, and the Vice President of the United States did not know it existed. Harry Truman was 61 years old when he became President of the United States on April 12, 1945, the day Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia. Truman had been Vice President for 82 days. He had not been brought into Roosevelt's inner circle on strategic matters. He was not read into the most consequential weapons program in history. The day after he took the oath of office, Secretary of War Henry Stimson told him, Truman later wrote that he felt as though a load of hay had fallen on him. What was falling on him was the responsibility for a decision that had not yet been articulated, about a weapon whose capabilities had not yet been proven, in a war whose end could not yet be calculated. 3 months later, he would have to decide. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese military was not waiting. They had read the same geography the American planners had read. They understood that Kyushu was the necessary first step for any invasion of the home islands. And beginning in the spring of 1945, they began moving forces there with a concentration that American intelligence analysts found, as the summer progressed, increasingly alarming. The Japanese plan was called Ketsugo. Its objective was not to repel the American invasion in any conventional military sense. No one in the Japanese military leadership in the summer of 1945 believed that was possible. The objective was to make the cost of the invasion so catastrophic in terms of American lives that the United States government would agree to a negotiated peace rather than continue, a peace with conditions acceptable to Japan. Preserving the emperor, preserving the structure of the Japanese state, avoiding the kind of unconditional surrender that had been demanded. To pursue that objective, the Japanese assembled everything they had left. Approximately 10,000 aircraft, including several thousand configured for kamikaze missions, were dispersed across Kyushu and the surrounding region, hidden in caves and under camouflage, waiting for the invasion fleet. 14 divisions were transferred to Kyushu. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, men and women, elderly and young, were organized into irregular defense units and trained with bamboo spears and obsolete rifles. A nation that had been at war for 14 years and had lost most of its navy and much of its air force was mobilizing its population for a final stand on home soil. And here is the detail that changes the way you read every document from that summer. The Americans knew. Through signals intelligence, through the interception and decryption programs known as MAGIC and ULTRA, American analysts had been reading a significant portion of Japanese military communications. They knew about Ketsugo, they knew about the aircraft concentrations, they knew about the troop movements, they could watch in near real time the Japanese defensive buildup on Kyushu. What this intelligence did to the American casualty estimates was not make them smaller, it made them larger. Each week through the summer of 1945, as the intelligence picture of the Kyushu buildup became clearer, the estimated cost of Olympic grew. By July, some internal planning documents were projecting American casualties for the full Kyushu campaign, not just the first 90 days, in the range of 500,000 or more. Nimitz read these documents. He set them down. He did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the documents had not already said. The invasion was the plan. Executing the plan was his job. And everyone involved understood that the plan, executed as designed, would cost a number of American lives that made the battles of the previous 3 years look, in some terrible statistical sense, like a preparation. All of this is what was on the table in June of 1945. This is what Chester Nimitz was looking at when he read that estimate. This is what 267,000 in the average case actually means when you put it in context. It means the people who wrote that number thought it was the middle of the range. It means they thought worse was possible. It means they built a plan around it anyway because no one had produced a reason not to. 2,000 miles away in the desert of New Mexico, someone was working on a reason. Pip, two roads running side by side on the 12th of April, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. On the 13th, Henry Stimson sat down with Harry Truman and told him about a project the United States government had been running for 4 years at a cost of approximately $2 billion. Involving hundreds of thousands of workers across facilities in 3 states, all aimed at a single objective that had never been achieved in the history of human civilization. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. No one had told him. The scale of what Stimson was describing was almost impossible to process in a single conversation, but Truman had to process it, because the project was, by April of 1945, close to completion. And what it produced, if it worked, was going to land on his desks as a decision. He had not campaigned on it, he had not been briefed on it, he had not chosen it, and now he owned it. The Manhattan Project had 2 parallel paths running toward the same destination. The first produced a plutonium implosion device, the design that would eventually be tested at Trinity. The second produced a uranium gun-type device, simpler in engineering, never tested before, used because the scientists were confident enough in the physics. The man at the center of the scientific work was Julius Robert Oppenheimer, 41 years old, the director of the laboratory at Los Alamos. He was brilliant in a way that made other brilliant people feel they were thinking at half speed. He was also, By the summer of 1945, a man who was beginning to understand things that the calculations on his blackboard had not fully prepared him for. In 1965, 20 years after the Trinity test, Oppenheimer was interviewed for a television documentary. When asked what he thought at the moment of the explosion on July 16, 1945, he described a passage from the Bhagavad Gita that came to him, the words of the god Vishnu, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." That quotation has been attached to that morning in New Mexico ever since, but he did not say it at Trinity. He said it in a television interview 2 decades later, remembering what he thought the actual moment was more complicated and less literary. Multiple witnesses described a range of reactions, from relief that it worked, to stunned silence, to the specific, peculiar terror of having done something that cannot be undone. The distinction matters, not to diminish what happened, but because the reality is more honest than the legend, and the reality is already extraordinary enough. Alongside Oppenheimer was General Leslie Groves, 49 years old, the military director of the project. Groves was not a man given to philosophical reflection about what he was building. He was a man who managed budgets, timelines, logistical problems, and security protocols at a scale that no military officer had ever managed before. His concern in the summer of 1945 was whether the devices would be ready, whether they would work, and whether the weather over Japan would cooperate with the delivery schedules. These two men needed each other in a way that is rare in any organization. Groves could not do the physics. Oppenheimer could not manage the bureaucracy, and neither of them could make the decision that was coming. That decision belonged to Truman, but before the decision came, someone else made a choice that is less discussed and more consequential than most people realize. Secretary of War Stimson was 77 years old. He had served in the cabinets of 4 presidents. He had been to Japan before the war. He had visited Kyoto. Target Committee, the group responsible for selecting which Japanese cities would be struck by atomic bombs, had placed Kyoto on its list. Kyoto was an ideal target by the metrics the committee was using: a large urban area, significant industrial and military infrastructure, previously untouched by conventional bombing, and a geography that would allow the blast effects to be fully observed and studied. Stimson removed it, not once, but repeatedly. Groves put it back on the list multiple times. Stimson removed it each time. His stated reason was that the destruction of Kyoto, a city of profound cultural and spiritual significance to the Japanese people, would make the post-war relationship between Japan and the United States irreparable. You might end the war by destroying Kyoto, but you would ensure that the peace that followed was poisoned from the start. His actual knowledge of Kyoto, his direct personal experience of the city, almost certainly shaped that judgment in ways that were not purely strategic. He had been there, he knew what it was, and he refused to destroy it regardless of what the Target Committee recommended. Nagasaki was a secondary target, a backup for a city called Kokura. On August 9th, 1945, the aircraft assigned to the mission arrived over Kokura. Cloud cover and smoke obscured the target. After 3 passes over the city that could not confirm the aiming point, the crew diverted to Nagasaki. The decision that determined which city received the second bomb was not made by Truman, not by Groves, not by the Target Committee. It was made by the weather over northern Kyushu on the morning of August 9th. These are the kinds of facts that resist the tidy narratives that form around historical events. The randomness does not diminish the gravity, it deepens it. Inside Japan during the same weeks, a different kind of deadlock was playing out. The body responsible for Japan's strategic direction was the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, known informally as the Big Six. It consisted of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Army Minister, the Navy Minister, and the 2 service chiefs. By custom and structure, consequential decisions required their consensus. After Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, the Big Six met. The count was 3-3. 3 members believed Japan should accept surrender with a single condition: the preservation of the emperor and the imperial system. 3 members believed Japan should continue fighting unless the Allies agreed to conditions that the Allies would never accept, including that Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials and that no Allied forces would occupy Japanese territory. They had just had 2 cities destroyed by weapons. They did not fully understand. They had just watched the Soviet Union declare war on August 8th and send 1.5 million soldiers into Manchuria, and they were still 3-3. The Soviet declaration of war requires its own moment of attention. For months, Japan had been attempting, through diplomatic channels, to persuade the Soviet Union to serve as a mediator in potential peace negotiations with the United States. Stalin had signed the Yalta Agreement with Roosevelt in February of 1945 committing the Soviet Union to enter the Pacific War within 90 days of Germany's defeat in exchange for territorial concessions in the Far East. Stalin had not told the Japanese about this agreement. He had kept his channels of communication open with Tokyo while preparing to attack. When the Soviet Union declared war on August 8th, Japan's last strategic hope, the possibility of a negotiated peace through Soviet mediation, collapsed in a single announcement. Multiple Japanese historians, examining the documents of the period, have concluded that the Soviet declaration of war was the decisive shock, more than either atomic bomb, in forcing the question of surrender. The reasoning is straightforward. Japan had been preparing psychologically and politically for a war with the United States. It had not prepared for the total collapse of the one neutral power it believed might save it. Whether the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war, or whether the Soviet declaration would have been sufficient, or whether both together were needed, or whether none of them were the actual deciding factor, is a question that historians have been debating for 80 years and have not resolved. This story presents the question without resolving it. Anyone who tells you the answer is simple is telling you something that the evidence does not support. Through all of this, the preparations for Operation Olympic continued. The troops assigned to the invasion did not stand down after Hiroshima. The fleet did not disperse after Nagasaki. The planning staffs did not suspend their work while Washington waited for Tokyo to respond. The logic was precise and unmerciful. If Japan did not surrender, Olympic was scheduled to begin November 1st. The preparation timeline required that everything be in place, whether the political situation resolved or not. You could not begin dispersing a 700,000-man invasion force after the fact and expect to reassemble it on schedule if the surrender did not come. Both roads were running in parallel toward the same deadline. Then came the night of August 14th. Inside Japan, Emperor Hirohito had intervened directly in the Big Six deliberations on the night of August 9th into the morning of the 10th. This intervention was extraordinary by any measure of Japanese political custom. The emperor was not expected to express opinions in policy meetings. He was expected to embody the will of the state, not to formulate it. For Hirohito to speak directly and to say that he believed the war must end was a rupture in the ceremonial structure of Japanese governance that those present had never witnessed and could not have predicted. His intervention broke the deadlock, but it did not end the resistance. On the night of August 14th, a group of army officers who refused to accept the emperor's decision moved to seize the imperial palace. Their objective was to find and destroy the phonograph recordings that Hirohito had made of his surrender, re-script to the Japanese people, announcing the end of the war. If they could destroy the recordings before they were broadcast, they believed they could force a continuation of the fighting. They occupied the palace. They searched for the recordings. They did not find them. The recordings had been hidden by palace staff. By the early morning of August 15th, the coup had failed. Its leaders committed suicide. The recordings were intact. At noon on August 15th, 1945, the voice of the Emperor of Japan was broadcast on Japanese radio for the first time in history. The language he used was classical Japanese, formal enough that many of those who heard it could not understand every word. But the meaning was clear. Japan would accept the terms of the Allied nations. The news reached Guam, the news reached Washington, the news reached every unit in the Pacific that had been preparing for November 1st. Operation Downfall was over. It had never begun Party 3, the plan that was never executed. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay, the sun in the morning sky over Japan, a flotilla of Allied warships at anchor. And in the center of it, the battleship USS Missouri, her decks crowded with officers and correspondents and photographers and the men who had fought across the Pacific for nearly 4 years. Nimitz stepped to the signing table. He picked up a pen. He signed his name on behalf of the United States Navy. He did not speak. He had spent the summer planning a war that did not have to be fought. He had read the documents. He had understood the numbers. He had prepared as thoroughly as any officer in American history had ever prepared for an operation that would have put more Americans in harm's way in a single day than any operation since the beginning of recorded conflict. It was not going to happen. 767,000 Americans who had trained for Operation Olympic were alive. They were somewhere in the Pacific, or they were at sea on ships moving toward an invasion that had been cancelled, or they were in the United States beginning to understand that they were going home. None of them had stormed the beaches with names taken from American automobiles. None of them had fought their way into the mountains of Kyushu. None of them had died in the average case. What had happened instead was this. 2 cities had been destroyed. 200,000 people, the estimates vary and are disputed, had died from the atomic bombs and their effects in the weeks that followed. A generation of Japanese survivors, the Hibakusha, carried the physical and psychological consequences of those moments for the rest of their lives. The arithmetic of that exchange 2 cities against what downfall would have required is the argument that has been made in defense of the decision since 1945. It is not a comfortable argument. It was not designed to be comfortable. Comfortable arguments do not arise from situations like the summer of 1945. What complicates the arithmetic further is everything that was happening simultaneously. The Soviet declaration of war on August 8th. The collapse of Japan's hope for Soviet mediation, the Emperor's direct intervention on the night of August 9th, the failed coup of August 14th. Each of these was a node in a web of contingency that produced the surrender. Remove any one of them, and the outcome might have been different. The problem with the argument that the atomic bombs ended the war is that the war was also being ended by other things at the same time, and it is not possible to separate the effects cleanly. Koichika Anami, the army minister who had led the resistance to surrender within the Big Six, did not hear the broadcast on August 15th. He died before it aired. On the night of August 14th, while the coup attempt was still underway in the palace, Anami performed seppuku in the traditional manner at his brother-in-law's house. He had put on his dress uniform, he knelt, he died slowly in the manner that his code required. His death note, handwritten, read, "Believing in Japan's Holy Land, I die. With my death, I humbly apologize to the Emperor for the great crime." He was not apologizing for the war. He was not apologizing for Japan's defeat. He was apologizing for having voted within the Big Six against the Emperor's expressed will. In the value system he had lived by his entire life, that was the unforgivable act, not losing a war, contradicting the Emperor. The document he left behind tells you more about the internal logic of Japan in August of 1945 than anything a historian can write to explain it. Now, there is a particular complication in the story of Chester Nimitz that does not appear in most accounts of this period, and it is worth examining carefully because it speaks to the honesty of the question. This story is asking, in the years after the war, Nimitz did not speak about these events with a single unified voice. In some contexts, in some speeches and interviews and private communications, he expressed the view that Japan had been so close to surrender by the summer of 1945 that the atomic bombs may not have been necessary. In other contexts, in other conversations and official statements, he did not question the decision that was made. He was not contradicting himself from inconsistency. He was reflecting an honest truth about what the situation actually was. No single person in the summer of 1945 could see the complete picture. Nimitz saw the military side, the casualty estimates, the intelligence about Ketsugo, the Kyushu buildup. He did not see the full picture of the internal Japanese deliberations. Truman saw the decision he had to make, but not all the factors that would eventually make Japanese surrender possible. Hirohito saw his nation's internal collapse, but not the American casualty projections that were driving the decision in Washington. The whole picture, assembled from all of those partial views, is only visible from 80 years of distance and access to documents that none of them had. The people making the decisions were working in the dark, with incomplete information against a deadline that was measured in weeks. The question of whether the atomic bombs were necessary, in the sense of being the minimum force required to produce the outcome, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty, because the counterfactual, what would have happened if they had not been used, does not exist. We know what happened. We do not know what would have happened instead. What we do know is that Operation Downfall was a real plan. It was not a hypothetical. It was not a negotiating position. It was a detailed, fully resourced military operation with a specific start date, a specific objective, and specific casualty projections that the people writing them believed were honest. We know that 767,000 Americans trained for a landing that never happened. We know that those men are the American half of the equation that any honest accounting must include. And we know that the Japanese half of the equation, the civilians who would have been on Kyushu when the landings came, the soldiers who would have fought with everything they had left, the population of the home islands that would have experienced a conventional war fought on Japanese soil, those numbers do not exist because the event that would have produced them did not occur. Cost of what was avoided cannot be calculated with precision. The cost of what replaced it is documented and disputed and debated and mourned. Both of those things are true. Both of them belong in the same accounting. On the deck of the Missouri, on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, Nimitz signed his name and stepped back. The ceremony concluded. The war in the Pacific was over. He had built the largest invasion plan in American history. It had been superseded by events before the first ship reached its objective. The plan he built, the plan that was never executed, shaped the post-war world in ways that plans which are executed rarely match. The nuclear doctrine of the Cold War grew directly from the summer of 1945. The decision to preserve the emperor, supported by both Nimitz and MacArthur as essential to a workable occupation, shaped the Japan that emerged from the war. Article 9 of the 1947 Japanese Constitution, which renounced war as an instrument of national policy, was written in the shadow of everything that had just happened. A plan that was never carried out had produced a world that has now existed for 8 decades. There is no clean ending to this story. There is no moment at which it becomes possible to say, and that is why the decision was right, or wrong, or necessary, or avoidable. The documents exist. The casualty estimates are there. The planning files for Operation Downfall are declassified and available. The records of the Big Six deliberations have been translated and studied. The memoirs and interviews of the people involved are in the archives. What they tell you, collectively, is that the summer of 1945 was a moment when the weight of decisions about human life was concentrated in the hands of a small number of people who were working with incomplete information under enormous pressure toward a deadline that could not be moved. Nimitz was one of them. He did what his job required. He built the plan, he prepared to execute it, and he lived for the rest of his life with the knowledge of what it had contained. The men who trained for the beaches with the names of American automobiles went home. Nimitz signed his name and stepped back. The Missouri sat in Tokyo Bay, and the summer was over. And the question that it had asked, the question at the center of all of it, remains exactly as difficult as it was the day he set that document down in Guam and did not speak.